The air in 1944 was thick with smoke and surrender, the collapsing Reich drawing every soul into its ruin. In the wreckage of that year, 6 women who had been bound to the German war machine in ways they had never chosen found themselves pulled into the hands of the enemy. For years they had been taught that capture meant humiliation, starvation, perhaps even death. Yet when American forces overtook the shattered towns and villages, what followed was not the cruelty they feared, but a bewildering unraveling of everything they thought they knew. Their footsteps crossed into foreign custody, their bodies exhausted, their spirits frayed, and their eyes searching for meaning in a war that had devoured all certainty. Before we follow their journey, I ask you to stay with us through this story. If you find yourself drawn into the voices of the past, help carry their memory forward. Share it, let others witness it, and subscribe so that these stories, though once silenced, may not vanish again. Now let us set the stage for what is to come. The winter of 1944 lay across Germany like a shroud. The air was brittle with cold, and yet the smoke of burning cities made the sky heavy, pressing low over the land as if it too shared the exhaustion of a nation unraveling. Hunger had long since settled into every stomach, a slow burning ache that turned bone light and faces hollow. Amid this collapsing world, 6 women found their lives colliding not through choice or kinship, but through the sheer gravity of war. Each of them carried the marks of a different Germany, yet all were being drawn toward the same uncertain fate. Greta, the seamstress from Hamburg, still remembered the sound of the firestorm that had devoured her neighborhood months before. The Reich had told her those who died in the flames were martyrs for victory, but all she remembered was the shriek of collapsing walls and the smell of fabric, burnt wool, scorched leather, that no sermon could cleanse. Marta, the farmhand from Silesia, had trudged west with a bundle of belongings after soldiers took her family's oxen for the war. She had always thought the soil beneath her fingernails was her inheritance, but even the land had been conscripted. Clara, the nurse from Dresden, wore hands roughened by endless bandages, but there was no bandage thick enough to stop the bleeding of a city that awaited its own inferno. Hilda, the widow from Cologne, moved with the silence of someone whose grief had hardened into routine, her husband taken by the first campaigns in the East, her son by the second. Lotta, scarcely 18, carried eyes far older than her years, drawn from a village in the Black Forest where fairy tales had once lived, but now only ration lines did. And Ruth, daughter of a man lost to Stalingrad, bore the bitterness of promises betrayed, her youth spent in service to a fatherland that consumed its children without a second thought. Together, though strangers, they were gathered in the wake of retreat, herded by circumstance into the path of the advancing Americans. They had been auxiliaries, workers, conscripts of labor and circumstance, tied to the Reich's war machine without ever touching a rifle. Their bodies were weary, their spirits brittle, yet propaganda clung to them as tightly as the thin coats on their backs. The broadcast that crackled from broken radios still spoke of enemy cruelty. Capture, they were told, would mean shame, violation, perhaps execution. The Americans would strip them of what little remained. Fear gnawed sharper than hunger. The moment of capture was neither heroic nor cinematic. It came at a crossroads outside a nameless village where the last German soldiers had already melted away. Snow lay trampled into brown slush, and the 6 women, half-starved, carried what bundles they could not bear to abandon. The sudden rumble of engines was enough to still their steps. Out of the whitened horizon came the olive-drab trucks of the Americans, their insignia unfamiliar, yet unmistakably foreign. The women froze, clutching one another as if touch could protect them. The soldiers who emerged were young, bundled in thick coats, faces ruddy from the cold. Their language was a storm of syllables the women barely grasped, but the tone was not one of cruelty. Commands were barked, hands gestured, weapons held firm, but not fired. The women raised their arms, their voices trembling in broken German as if surrender could be stitched together by words alone. For a heartbeat, they expected the end. For a heartbeat, they thought of the broadcasts that promised blood. But what followed was only an odd silence, broken by the scraping of boots and the muttered laughter of men who, to the women's astonishment, seemed almost indifferent. The 6 were gathered, searched quickly, their bundles examined. No violence came. Instead, the soldiers guided them toward the trucks with a kind of brisk efficiency, neither tender nor cruel. Hilda, the widow, whispered under her breath that perhaps the true cruelty would begin later, in some hidden camp where no eyes could witness it. Lotta gripped Ruth's sleeve as though the fabric were a lifeline. The scent of the Americans lingered in the air. Tobacco, gasoline, the faintest whiff of soap. It was absurdly foreign. Night fell swiftly, and with it came the crackle of fires built in metal barrels, the glow of strange cigarettes burning in the hands of the enemy. The women huddled together, cold seeping through every seam of their thin coats, their fear sharpened by the knowledge that they were no longer free, yet not destroyed either. They were caught in a purgatory, a suspension between two fates. Behind them lay the ruins of Germany, ahead a captivity painted in the darkest colors by the Reich. And yet, even in those first hours, something unspoken pressed upon them. The contradiction of being alive when death had seemed certain. Greta stared at the sky, where the smoke of a burning town blurred the stars. She thought of her sewing needles, the small tools of creation she had once believed could hold a household together. Now she wondered if any thread could stitch the world back into sense. Clara, the nurse, rubbed her raw hands together and thought of all the patients she could not save, as though those ghosts had followed her into captivity. Marta muttered a prayer she half remembered, not for salvation, but for endurance. And so began their journey, not on trains or ships, but on the very roads where armies clashed and retreated. 6 women, 6 fragments of a fractured land, carried forward into an unknown captivity. The last winter of the Reich had taken everything from them except the fragile, stubborn pulse of survival. That pulse carried them forward into the hands of strangers, where fear would soon give way to an even greater shock, the dissonance of kindness. The morning after their capture arrived, not with gunfire or brutality, but with the blunt efficiency of military routine. The 6 women were woken not by shouts, but by the crunch of boots on frozen ground, the clatter of mess tins, the low murmur of soldiers speaking in a language that rolled like stones in a river. The Americans moved about with a confidence that was neither hurried nor cruel, as though they had long grown accustomed to victory. For the women, every moment felt borrowed, each gesture from their captors a puzzle piece that refused to fit into the dark mosaic the Reich had painted for them. They were ordered into the back of a truck, its canvas flaps drawn against the cold. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of fuel and damp wool. They sat, pressed together, their bundles at their feet, the floor vibrating with the engine's growl. The soldiers guarding them did not leer, did not strike. They sat with rifles balanced across their laps, faces calm, almost disinterested. The women exchanged glances, each silently questioning what cruelty waited once the truck stopped. Hilda clutched her coat tighter, as though armor could be made from threadbare cloth. Hours passed. The countryside rolled by in glimpses through gaps in the canvas, skeletal trees, villages reduced to rubble, fields that lay fallow under snow. Every mile carried them deeper into a realm that felt less like home, more like exile. Hunger gnawed with renewed force. The brittle bread crusts they had hoarded long since crumbled to dust. When the truck jolted to a halt at midday, one of the soldiers climbed inside and placed a crate at their feet. He said nothing, merely motioned. Inside lay tins of food, heavy and unfamiliar, stamped with letters they could not read. For a moment, none dared touch them. Was this a trick? Poison disguised as mercy. Ruth's stomach betrayed her with a growl that broke the silence. The soldier, exhaling a plume of smoke, tapped the tins with the toe of his boot, then stepped back. Tentatively, Clara pried one open, the sharp scent of meat and fat wafting into the frigid air. It was stew, thick, greasy, rich beyond imagination. She passed it to Greta, who dipped trembling fingers inside before stopping herself, ashamed at her own hunger. Yet the others followed, spooning greedily with whatever could serve as cutlery. The warmth spread through their chests, and in that moment, survival felt like betrayal. How could the enemy feed them when their own land starved them? That night, they were led into a makeshift camp, little more than tents and wooden huts erected near a crossroads where supplies and men converged. Barbed wire enclosed the perimeter, not as a fortress, but as an afterthought. The women were separated from soldiers, quartered together in a drafty hut with cots lined side by side. It was warmer than the ruins they had left behind, and blankets, coarse but clean, were stacked in the corner. They unrolled them with suspicion, as though comfort itself must be barbed. Sleep did not come easily. The crackle of foreign voices outside reminded them of their captivity. Yet no boots stormed inside, no hands tore at their coats. Instead, the night hummed with distant laughter, the thud of cards laid on tables, the hiss of radios carrying music they had never heard before. The sound of an unfamiliar song drifting through the dark was perhaps the strangest cruelty of all. It was not menace, but indifference, as if their captors barely considered them dangerous enough to hate. In the days that followed, the strangeness only deepened. They were marched under guard, but without jeers. When asked their names, the Americans wrote them carefully, stumbling over syllables yet repeating them until they sounded almost right. Greta found herself stunned when a soldier handed her an apple, bright and red against the winter grey. She turned it over in her hands for long minutes before daring to bite, the crisp sweetness so foreign it seemed impossible. Marta wept quietly that night, ashamed not of captivity, but of the gratitude swelling against her will. The Reich had told them the enemy would take everything, dignity, life, even womanhood. Instead, what was being stripped from them was certainty. Each meal, each gesture, each absence of cruelty dismantled the walls of belief they had built around themselves. Ruth whispered to Lotta one night that perhaps this was only a prelude, a soft deception before the real suffering began. Yet as days passed, the weight of expectation itself became unbearable, as though waiting for cruelty was more exhausting than enduring it. Clara, the nurse, noticed the smallest details. She saw how the soldiers washed their hands before eating, how their uniforms smelled faintly of soap, how they treated even prisoners with the flat consistency of rules rather than the whims of rage. It unsettled her more than any threat could have, because it hinted at a kind of order that Germany had lost long before the bombs. Hilda, the widow, kept her silence, but inside she felt a slow erosion, a quiet fear that her grief was being joined by something else. Doubt. By the time the women were transferred deeper behind American lines, the outlines of captivity had shifted. They were no longer expecting execution with every sunrise. Instead, they were caught in the dissonance of being treated less like enemies and more like unwanted guests. And yet in their hearts, suspicion smouldered. Could kindness itself be a weapon? Could food and blankets be chains more binding than barbed wire? The questions pressed upon them as heavily as the cold. They did not yet know that in the days to come, they would be offered not just survival but dignity. And dignity, they would learn, could cut sharper than hunger. The camp that awaited them was unlike anything the women had imagined. They had braced themselves for cages, for filth, for the slow cruelty of neglect. Instead, they were led through gates into an enclosure where order seemed to govern every corner. Wooden barracks lined the perimeter. Smoke drifted from chimneys, and the air carried not the stench of rot, but the clean bite of wood smoke mixed with something else. Soap. That faint fragrance unsettled them most of all, because it spoke of a life where cleanliness was not a luxury, but a given. They were assigned to a single barrack, a space with cots arranged in rows. Each bed covered with a coarse blanket folded sharply at the edges. The sight alone made their stomachs twist. In Germany, even families with means had been reduced to sleeping in cellars or on straw, surrounded by rubble. Here, in enemy hands, they were offered beds as though they deserved rest. Hilda stood by her cot for long minutes, too wary to sit, as if lowering herself would mark a surrender of more than just her body. That first evening they were taken to a mess hall where steaming bowls awaited. The smell of broth, thick with vegetables and meat, drifted through the air. They carried their trays with trembling hands, the clatter of cutlery echoing in their ears like a blasphemy. Clara stared at her portion, a stew richer than any hospital ward had ever received, and felt a wave of nausea rise not from disgust, but from disbelief. Eating it felt like betrayal, and yet hunger spoke louder than pride. Spoonful by spoonful they consumed the food, each mouthful pressing deeper into the cracks of their certainty. But it was the wash-house that broke them. The following morning they were led to a long wooden building with steam seeping from its roof. Inside, showers lined the walls, water hissing in streams that filled the room with warmth. Bars of soap were stacked in baskets, their scent sharp and clean, almost floral. For a moment, the women froze at the threshold. The Reich had filled their ears with stories of showers that were not showers at all, whispered horrors from the east that no one dared repeat too loudly. Ruth's knees buckled, and Greta reached to steady her. But the guards stood back, indifferent, waiting. Clara, ever the nurse, was the first to step forward. She lifted a bar of soap, turning it in her hands, feeling its weight, its slippery promise of purity. It was absurd, so small, so ordinary. Yet her eyes blurred as though she held a miracle. Slowly, the others followed, undressing with hesitant hands, clutching themselves in shame. The water came hot, rolling over skin that had been cloaked in grime and exhaustion for months. Dirt ran in rivulets down the drains, the colour of war itself being washed from their bodies. Lotta wept openly, the sound echoing against the tiles. She was 18, and the warmth on her skin felt like something she had never known, something her childhood should have given her, but never had. Marta scrubbed her arms with desperate force, as if she could erase not just dirt, but years of submission to fields, to orders, to hunger. Hilda stood under the water, unmoving, tears mixing silently with the streams, the weight of grief loosening if only for the span of a breath. When they emerged, wrapped in clean towels, Their bodies trembled not from cold, but from the unbearable tenderness of the moment. They had expected brutality, and instead they were given dignity. Yet that gift was as painful as any wound. To be washed by the enemy was to be confronted with the collapse of everything they had believed. Propaganda had promised them shame, but what they felt was something deeper. The shattering of certainty itself. That night, lying on their cots with clean skin and full stomachs, none of them could sleep. Greta whispered into the dark that perhaps the war was already lost, not in battle, but in the simple kindness of soap and bread. Ruth argued that it was all strategy, a calculated deception meant to weaken their loyalty. But even as she spoke, she clutched her blanket closer, unable to deny the comfort it gave. Clara listened to their murmurs and thought of her patients back in Dresden, the ones who had died for lack of bandages, for lack of medicine, for lack of mercy. Here, in the hands of the enemy, she found abundance where her homeland had offered scarcity. The shame of survival pressed upon them like a second skin. Gratitude warred with loyalty, confusion warred with pride. They were prisoners, yet they were being treated with a humanity their own leaders had denied them. In the silence of that night, as the camp settled into the rhythms of foreign songs and the distant chirping of crickets, the 6 women lay awake, caught between hunger and satiety, dirt and cleanliness, despair and dignity. For the first time, they realized captivity was not the nightmare. The true torment was the dissonance of kindness. The days inside the camp began to fold into one another, marked not by terror, but by a strange and steady rhythm. Roll call at dawn, meals at regular intervals, work assignments that kept hands busy but rarely punished the body beyond endurance. For 6 women who had lived through bombings, hunger, and the merciless machinery of their own collapsing nation, the calm itself felt like an illusion. It was not freedom, yet it was not hell either. It was something in between, a silence between nations. Outside the wire, the war roared on. They heard it in fragments, the rumble of distant artillery, the low growl of planes cutting across the sky. Sometimes rumors arrived with new prisoners, whispers of towns consumed in fire, of armies retreating, of a Reich buckling under its own lies. The women listened with faces pale, the words both confirming and unraveling everything they had been told. Clara remembered a soldier, captured in the same convoy, whispering that Dresden itself would be next. She pressed the thought down like a wound she dared not touch. Inside the camp, life pressed forward with unsettling normalcy. They were given tasks, sorting laundry, mending uniforms, peeling vegetables for the kitchens. Greta, the seamstress, found herself once again with needle and thread in her hands, repairing trousers torn by soldiers she did not know. Each stitch felt absurd, a parody of the life she had once lived in Hamburg, but also a reminder that her hands could still create, however small the act. Marta, the farmhand, tended small patches of soil within the fence line, pulling weeds with practice movements. To her astonishment, a guard once offered her a handful of seeds, gesturing that she might plant them. She buried them in the cold earth, not knowing if she hoped they would grow. The women spoke to one another in low voices at night, weaving their stories into a fragile tapestry. Hilda told of Cologne, of the cathedral that still stood like a blackened sentinel while the city around it crumbled. Ruth whispered of her father at Stalingrad, her voice hard, almost brittle, as though speaking his name was itself a defiance. Lotta shared half-remembered songs from her childhood, the melodies trembling as if they too feared captivity. These exchanges, soft and uncertain, built a kind of fellowship, not born of friendship, but of necessity. Yet with every passing day, the silence grew heavier. It was not just the quiet of the camp, but the quiet inside themselves. Who were they now? Prisoners, yes. Germans, yes, but also something else, something stripped of certainty. The Reich had told them the Americans were beasts, and yet the Americans gave them food. The Reich had promised them honor in suffering, and yet here they were, cleaner, fuller, safer than they had been in their own homeland. The contradiction gnawed, sharper than hunger ever had. Sometimes the silence broke in unexpected ways. One afternoon, Clara was summoned to tend a small cut on a soldier's hand. The American had sliced his palm on a crate, and though she could not understand his words, his trust was evident as he extended his bleeding hand toward her. She cleaned the wound, bandaged it with steady fingers, her body trembling as she worked. When he nodded in thanks, she felt the world tilt. To care for the enemy, to be thanked by him, it was a wound upon her very sense of self. That night, she did not speak. There were darker rumors too. New prisoners whispered of camps far away, places where showers did not bring warmth but death, where barbed wire closed not on mercy but annihilation. The women did not know whether to believe them. The Reich had forbidden such stories, branding them as enemy lies. Yet here they were, held by the same enemy, and nothing matched what they had been told. Truth itself had become as fragile and fractured as the world beyond the fences. The Americans seemed content to leave them in their limbo, offering neither cruelty nor freedom. The guards smoked, played cards, listened to radios that carried news in clipped English they could not understand. Sometimes music spilled into the night, swing tunes, jaunty rhythms that seemed obscene in their cheerfulness. The women lay awake, listening, wondering how a world could dance while theirs lay in ruins. In that silence, identities began to shift. Greta no longer thought of herself only as a seamstress from Hamburg. She was a prisoner, a survivor, someone whose hands stitched uniforms for enemies who treated her more gently than her own nation had. Marta, who had once cursed the soil for betraying her with famine, now knelt to coax seedlings into life with the enemy's seeds. Hilda, once defined by widowhood, found herself defined by something more unsteady, an uneasy gratitude she did not want to feel. The silence between nations was not peace. It was suspension, a waiting ground where every belief they had carried was tested against reality. And as the days stretched into weeks, one truth pressed heavier than all the others. Captivity was not what they feared. It was what it revealed. Spring crept slowly across the camp, softening the edges of winter with muddy paths and the first hints of green pushing through the thaw. For the 6 women, time had stretched into something elastic, days repeating with familiar routines, nights stretching long with whispers and thoughts they could not quiet. By now they no longer flinched at the guard's footsteps or trembled at the sound of foreign commands. The strangeness of captivity had dulled, but the weight of what lay ahead grew heavier with each sunrise. Rumors of Germany's collapse had hardened into certainty. New prisoners brought tales of advancing Soviet armies, of cities reduced to ash, of Hitler vanishing from the airwaves, only to reappear in increasingly desperate broadcasts. The women listened in silence, their hearts torn between dread and inevitability. Each whispered story was like a stone dropped into their chests. To return meant facing a homeland that no longer resembled the one they had left. Would there be homes to return to? Families still alive? Or only ruins, accusations, and suspicion? The Americans never spoke to them of the future, but the signs were unmistakable. Papers shuffled in the command tents, names recorded, movements planned. One evening, Clara overheard a soldier speaking to another, catching enough words in fractured German to understand. Soon they would be repatriated. The word itself was like a blade, sharp, final, leaving no room for choice. Repatriated, sent back to the land that had abandoned them, to people who might see their survival not as fortune, but as guilt. Around the barrack stove that night, the 6 women sat together, the silence broken only by the crackle of wood. Hilda spoke first, her voice low and steady. "When I go back, they will call me a collaborator. My husband is dead. My son is dead. And yet I lived, fed by the enemy. They will not forgive that." Her words settled like ash over the group. Greta shook her head, staring at her hands. "Hamburg is gone. The house where I sewed, the street where I grew up. It's rubble. There is nothing left to return to." Her voice cracked, though she did not weep. She had shed too many tears to summon more. Marta, the farmhand, clenched her fists. "The Americans gave me seeds. Seeds. My own people took my oxen, my land, everything. How do I go back to soil that betrayed me?" Ruth, bitter as ever, spat the words into the firelight. "You speak as though there is a choice. There is no choice. We are German. They will send us back, and we will carry their kindness like a curse. Gratitude is a chain heavier than iron." Lotta said nothing for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "I don't remember what home looks like. Only hunger lines, soldiers' boots, the sound of planes. If there is a home, I cannot picture it." She looked down at her hands, still calloused despite weeks of rest, and for the first time she seemed younger than her 18 years. Clara, who had listened quietly, finally raised her eyes. "We will go back, yes. But what we carry with us is not theirs to dictate. We saw something the Reich told us did not exist. Humanity in the enemy, kindness where there should have been cruelty. That is what will haunt us, and perhaps what will save us." Her words lingered, fragile but undeniable. For in their hearts they all knew the deepest irony of their survival, that the enemy had given them more dignity than their own nation. Soap and bread, warmth and blankets, these had become symbols not of captivity but of betrayal. Every kindness pressed against their loyalty until loyalty itself felt hollow. As the days shortened toward departure, the women found themselves looking at the Americans differently, not as saviors, not as monsters, but as men, flawed, indifferent, sometimes generous, sometimes careless. The sharp lines of propaganda had blurred into shades of grey. They had entered captivity fearing beasts. They would leave remembering men. On the morning of their transport, the women gathered their few belongings, blankets folded, coats tightened, eyes lowered. The guards called them to the trucks, the same olive-drab beasts that had first carried them into this silence. They climbed aboard, their hearts pounding with the weight of what lay ahead. Beyond the wire, the horizon stretched wide and uncertain, glowing faintly gold under the rising sun. They did not know if they would find their homes still standing, or if they themselves would be welcomed as daughters, sisters, neighbors, or rejected as women tainted by survival. But they knew this. They would carry with them the memory of soap in their hands, of stew warming their bellies, of a strange dignity found, not in victory, but in defeat. The road before them was rough, and the future uncertain. Yet as the trucks rolled forward, the 6 women sat together, their silence no longer empty, but heavy with the contradictions of war. They were returning, but they were not the same. And somewhere, Deep within the ruins of a collapsing Reich, the truth waited to be faced. That survival itself was the greatest act of defiance, and that sometimes the enemy's hand could hold more mercy than a homeland's embrace.